Just a moment, Dunya. I'm enabling your audio. There, you should have audio now.
Thank you, Juha. My name is Dunja Potočnik. I'm a sociologist, a youth researcher from Croatia, working at the Institute for Social Research in Zagreb since 2003. And since then, I'm actually active in youth policy as well. My PhD is actually on the social structure, intergenerational mobility, labor markets, and so on. But when it comes to the youth policy, I'm active on the topics of social inclusion, digitalization, and some other topics as well. So for today's topic, I will show you some framework, some theoretical framework, some data on the social inclusion and digitalization. And afterwards, we will have discussion based on two broad questions. So for a start, what about social inclusion and digital social inclusion? It is a topic that is quite often presented nowadays in media, in research, on the policy level as well. When we want to talk about social inclusion, first we have to define what is actually social exclusion. It happens on different levels based on the different criteria, and the young people have very different feeling or sense of social inclusion or exclusion. First of all, on the basic level, we have social exclusion or inclusion that happens due to existence or lack of facilities, infrastructure, services, and accessibility. Regarding this, we have very good examples of Finland and Estonia, where all municipalities have youth centers, so facilities and infrastructure that can be accessed by young people, so the young people can get the right, enjoy the leisure time, connect to other young people, and so on. Situation in majority of Eastern European countries is very different to this one. So in these areas, municipalities are not covered by such infrastructure and services. There is very often that only young people in the capital town or in the major towns can have such access. And because of this, the youth partnership has led different studies and analysis for identifying major struggles for young people. So the youth partnership study on barriers to social inclusion finding a place in modern Europe from 2015 refers to 5 areas of possible inclusion or exclusion that are education, labor market, living, health, and participation. These 5 areas are also called safety nets. So if they do exist, young people actually can feel included and related to other people, connected, and so on. If they are not existent, young people are actually can be called excluded. And what about digital social inclusion? First of all, we have to talk about some kind of risks or obstacles when it comes to the young people and digital social inclusion. On the first level, we can talk about media literacy. So whether young people can actually differentiate between different content, about reliability of different content, whether they can actually use different media or whether they know how to use different media. And also we have to talk about appropriateness of the content. So appropriateness in regard to the young person's age and most of all degree of their vulnerability. On a different side, we can talk about opportunities. It is great that we actually can use digital media because they can be user-tailored, they can be targeted and personalized, and young people can access content that is very, very easily digestible, so they know how to use it, they can access it, and it can be conceived in a youth-friendly manner, so they can actually be appealing to the young people. What is also good is that digital media can also be used in street youth work. So in completely direct youth work, when accessing young people who are actually difficult to access. So young people who have dropped out of school, young people who are actually not related to any kind of youth center, maybe even homeless young people, also young refugees, and so on. And what about challenges? On a general level, we can talk about major obstacles in regard to digital divide. So Study Debating Europe 2 years ago released some data on the digital divide in Europe. On one hand, we have Nordic countries and Scandinavian countries where around 2 to 3% of young people can have access to the internet only at school. On the other hand, we have Latvia and Mediterranean countries, even Hungary, and also countries from the Eastern Europe, where there are between 10 and 20% of young people who can have access to the internet only at school. So this is really a major obstacle for the digital social inclusion of young people. And what about other challenges? Other challenges happen along different lines and ask for diverse approaches in regard to many indicators. So first of all, we can talk about geographical differences. We have already tackled some of them. So there are major differences in the EU and also between non-EU and EU countries, especially when we talk about the countries covered by the Council of Europe. So we can have differences in regard to citizen status, so we can have refugees, asylum seekers. Also, we can have young homeless people who haven't asked or seek their citizenship. We can have minorities like Roma minorities and so on. Then there are also differences in regard to the social background. It is already well known that young people who come from families of a better income, of parents who have higher educational degree, usually have better networks, also have better access to some infrastructure, to the services. Usually these people know how to use the services and ask for help and so on. Also, when it comes to the education of the young people, in many European countries nowadays, you actually have many young people who only have a vocational education degree, for instance. And these young people very often lack the skills and knowledge and insights on how to access some infrastructure, some facilities, to ask for help, and to connect to other people who can actually help them. Also, there are major differences in regard to urban and rural areas. So in the rural areas, especially in the Eastern European countries and Mediterranean countries, you have many municipalities that don't have any kind of facility or infrastructure that can be accessed by young people. And also young people can access internet only during the school hours. In this sense, young people can be hesitant to use this infrastructure and facility at the schools because of the privacy issues and confidence and so on. Also, we have to talk about health issues. So there are some people who are disabled and maybe can't have access to facilities and can't use internet even at schools. Also, there are issues in regard to the mental health and mental health well-being. There are many new studies showing that actually mental health of young people is being deteriorated. So due to different social pressures and economic pressures and so on, so young people need help in this area as well. And sometimes it is very difficult for them to access some service, and maybe the best way for them to ask for help is to do it online. Also, there are some issues in regard to identity, especially if we talk about, for instance, LGBT community. Yesterday we had Gay Pride in Croatia, and it was wonderful to see how, you know, things are developing. But on the other hand, it was really sad to read to the comments on the internet, you know, on the after the news release. We still have hate speech, and due to this hate speech, young people can feel hesitant to access some portals and ask for help, even if their identity is actually protected. And last but not least, we have also cultural issues or barriers and some value issues. So due to their cultural background or the cultural society and some prevailing values, young people can actually feel hesitant to access even the online help. So this is about the challenges. And on the other hand, when we, for instance, look at the social media landscape that was released last year by Fred Cavazza, we can see that we have so many tools only on the level of the networks. And these are not the only tools. So really, if we talk about digital social inclusion, there are many means by we can help young people to feel more included and to offer them some more help and advice. So on a general level, despite the digital divide and difficulties in access to the internet, nowadays more than 19% of young people can actually access the internet via mobile phones. And therefore, we can actually recognize mobile applications as appropriate tool for social inclusion. Later on, you will see some good practice example where actually the mobile phone applications are those that can help young people to get included and to get some help and relate to their peers. In this sense, we can say that digital media is actually enabling, capacitating, empowering, and also gives anonymity and protects identity. What is also important to say, and you all know it, that new technologies are actually mainstreamed in youth culture. So young people do not perceive their online and offline world as something that is separate. And they actually fluidly inhabit both of these worlds simultaneously. This is also something that we have to be very cautious about. So when trying to digitally include young people, to take care that these are actually, this is actually the unique world for them. So these are not two separate entities. Therefore, digital youth work actually needs a holistic organization, integrated approach, and not to be regarded as a specialized service or a niche area. So always when we have digital inclusion we have to have in parallel face-to-face access for youth social inclusion. And what about methods? We can talk about many methods of digital social inclusion. Here I will list only some of them. So we have web-based youth work that can be youth-centered websites for external communication, or online youth information council services, or open youth activities center on the internet, or some channel that enables young people's participation and consultation on the internet. We can also use online games as tools in youth work, and we can have delayed or real-time online dialogue. Online youth work is something that can also be on several levels. So we can have online dialogue, real-time online youth work, youth centers online, and virtual youth centers. And what is on the top of this are actually multi-professional online centers that provide youth work. Later on, we we'll see some good practice example actually describing this multi-professional online youth work. Young people can also devise their own activities online, so we can have participatory and peer activities online. And yeah, what about the good practice examples? On the nationwide level, the UK is one of the countries that made the first steps. So in 2004, they have identified some needs of the young people, and they made the decision to make a digital inclusion unit at the level of the government. And after that, they have published the report Inclusion Through Innovation. And they actually invested quite vast funds into implementation of this report's recommendation. There's one project that can be identified as one of the good practice examples when it comes to the youth research. This is the eu-Kids online project. It has started in 2006, and since then, its results have been implemented widely on the European level, especially in the UK, since it is actually the project led by the London School of Economics. And another project, which is called Global Kids Online, actually grew out of this eu-Kids Online project. And now it is encompassing Europe, Latin America, Russia, Australia, and some other countries as well.
Dunia,
the other example of practice actually comes from Finland.
Sorry, Dunia, very quick comment from a participant from Kamil that we still should provide alternatives for the mobile applications because not everyone can use them. So from an accessibility standpoint, for example, some disabled people can't use the phone by themselves. So if we build something only based on these apps, it can actually exclude some people.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. We have to think about accessibility. So we should think about applications that can be moderated by voice and so on, by some movements. Yeah, of course. Thank you for this comment. So let us continue with the good practice example. The other good practice example comes from Finland, and it is called Netari project. It is actually locally based, or it was locally based. It started in 4 cities in 2004, and since 2008 it has evolved, and now it is implemented nationwide. And actually it relies on the multi-professional online youth work. Since 2012, the NGO Save the Children Finland actually coordinates this Netari project. And where the funding comes from the Ministry of Culture and Education and from the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health. So in Finland, really on the national level, on the governmental level, the needs to digitally include young people is well recognized, and there are well-established infrastructure facilities and so on. So this multi-professional network in Finland actually encompasses a health center with professional web nurses, with social service department, with social workers, with psychiatric nurse. Also, it has involved youth crime unit of police department of city of Oulu. And it is based on very well-established sustainability. So they have provided continuous training and education of the youth workers. They are continuously publishing on the blog of the Finnish Youth Research Society's page, on the online youth work manuals. They also release some study books, and they have regular service. They have 2 user group service per year at least, and also workers fill a service after every working hour and private conversation with the young participants. And what are the participation tools? So you have message boards, blogs, group chat, live streaming, digital games, competitions, polls, quiz, and chat at least 2 times a week. So young people can really have access to different means of social inclusion and getting help. And also young workers, youth workers and nurses host theme discussions weekly, and these themes discussions are being developed constantly. So depending on the needs of the young people that were identified through the service. The third good practice example comes from Denmark. Denmark is also one of the countries that have developed quite good infrastructure and facilities for youth work and for youth inclusion. And for instance, Gentofte community in Denmark has established face-to-face youth work and some project committees that consist of many young people, but also they have established mobile youth office. So they have a van with the youth workers that is commuting on the area of their community and enabling young people to access services of the youth centers more easily. And messages communicated to the young people with what is very important are that they can be different together, that everyone should have a voice, everyone should have open future, and no one should be alone. And here you have a list of several good practice examples. Of course, this list is not exhaustive. And after my presentation, I would like to talk about some more good practice examples. So we have already mentioned Estonia, that is actually a completely digital state. We have Denmark, Finland, Norway, where mobile phones are used to map the needs of the young people. Also, in the conference that was held in Portugal last week, we have learned that Thessaloniki in Greece has now just introduced a model for supporting youth centers with a dedicated budget line, so stable budget line, and digital consultation process, and the results are actually binding for the politicians. So this is a step forward for Greece. In Croatia, we also have only one case, a good example. The city of Varaždin is just developing a system of electronic voting on the youth issues. And the last good practice example is something that many of you have already heard about probably, and some of you are probably included in it. It's a proper project or a platform called Edge Riders. It has started in 2012, as I recall, and it actually in the beginning served as a place of meeting of young people with an open mind, but highly educated young people and digitally skillful young people. And since then, it has developed many tools and some minor platforms that are actually serving to the communities and to the many excluded communities throughout the world. So if you're interested in the youth work on a world level and into diving into something completely new, you could try the Edge Riders platform. When preparing this presentation and this webinar, I made a small desk survey on some of the guidelines used for the digital youth work. And I have actually found a checklist compiled by the National Youth Council of Ireland on the project Screenagers is something that can be very useful. So they have like 8 general guidelines in digital youth work. First of all, when you are preparing some content and activities for digital inclusion of young people, you should consider, is there a level of digital skills appropriate to the age group? Then, are there any vulnerable young people involved in these activities? Then, is there risk assessment? related to this project or program. Also, what about acceptable usage policy, especially if some data on the minors are going to be published? And also we have to take into regard new direction on the privacy released by the EU last month. Then we have to consider whether young people understand copyright or Creative Commons. Do we have consent and copyright permission to publish the work that we have made? And also, do the young people know how to access support or report any concerns? And at the end, how to actually measure outcomes for the young people. Means of digital inclusion of young people actually need a stable line of funding. It is very difficult, you know, to have project funding and to assure sustainability. So if you would like to get a stable funding, very often you have to have some measurable outcomes. So it would be very good to have a kind of indicators measuring your work. And what about personal level? So what about youth workers engaged in a digital world? There's also a short list. So in general, young people, young person or a person engaged in a digital youth work should be identifiable. So they should be presented by the name, surname, profession, and so on. Everything should be transparent. These people should be accessible and speak in a youth-friendly manner, should respond to the questions and to the needs of young people, should communicate according to the rules of written verbality. So if they were standing in front of the person they are communicated with, they should know that digital communication is never a one-way, but at least a two-way process. They should make a network, not just isolated contacts. And they should realize that the youth work in the digital world is not virtual. It is actually perceived by the young people as the real work. And what about peer-to-peer learning or peer-to-peer youth work? There are some threats to this. First of all, minors, due to their inexperience, maybe sometimes cannot, you know, cover all the topics that are needed to be covered, especially in regard to the needs of the other minors. So if you have teenagers, also there are some skills that have to be obtained by the young youth workers, and of course the content presented to the young people should be appropriate. And on the other side, there are many opportunities in regard to the peer work, and many youth workers who are of younger age really use these opportunities to help to their peers. So this is actually briefly from me, my presentation. And at the end, I would like to present you some new publications. The Youth Partnership has released a new publication last week, so this is the newest one. Perspectives on youth, young people in a digitalized world. And please look at this. They have many very interesting chapters and interesting conclusions and interesting recommendations. And the European Commission actually has released in parallel a study on the impact of the internet and social media on youth participation in youth work. And of course, there is YouthWiki as a source of information in an online space that is actually being constantly updated and can be used for youth work on your national, regional, or local level. So thank you. This is for my presentation. And now I will switch off my presentation and try to switch on my webcam. Okay. Let's see. Oh, sorry.
Dunia, before you go into your questions, there was one question from from Mara about young people being connected in general, and
yes, please.
Sorry?
Yes, please. I'm
Yep.
listening.
And
yep.
the question was, how about those people who are not connected? Even if the percentage is small, then perhaps they come to priority for social inclusion. And a question, do we know if these projects actually do not reproduce the real-life digital divide? And is there any research or checklist for this? How do we avoid these projects actually reproducing the real-life digital divide? I think this is the main question.
Yeah, I mean, it is very, very difficult to encompass all young people and to include all young people. First of all, in order to include young people have to feel safe. Then they have to have access to some kind of service or health provision. I have mentioned young people in the rural areas. These young people very often don't have any access, don't have skills, don't have knowledge, maybe even don't have technology to access digital youth work. In this sense, of course, we can think of some other tools like mobile youth work units, like the one I mentioned from Denmark. And this is one of the ways we can actually cover them or reach them. And what about the gaps or divisions that are being reproduced by the research? Yeah, I mean, when the surveys are made, usually, you get a certain amount of money for the aims that policymakers would like to be achieved. And these are actually made on the national level very often, or on the regional level. Usually when writing new youth strategy or the youth law and something like this. So it is really very difficult to say that youth research can cover all the topics and can cover vulnerable young people. And when talking to my colleagues from other European countries, it is actually quite similar in majority of them, apart from this northern part of Europe. So funding of the youth research is very irregular, actually. And also policymakers very often say that for them it is very difficult to digest all the data. So they usually take only one chunk of the data that is very easy to implement or, to mirror into the policy. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
There are two more questions also, or one comment. Mark E. Taylor is mentioning Coyote's new edition on smart and digital youth work, which will start going online next week. So that's a valuable resource, of course. Milos is asking to know more about examples in about the development of a system of electronic voting. And he asked a follow-up question: are they using system just to write about youth issues, or is there a list of youth issues and then they are voting which should be solved? So from what I understand of the question, who is actually deciding on what issues get voted on? How is the participation process structured?
Okay, so it is very good to know about this Coyote publication, of course, and about the topics in the digital inclusion and the voting. Well, usually you have youth council. So you have national youth council, municipality youth council, or the local youth council, and these youth councils are usually deciding together with the local politicians or people in the local administration on the priorities in youth policies on a certain time period. So in regard to this, young people can then vote on the issues that should be a priority or should be further developed. So it is, to my knowledge, it is never a decision only depending on the vote of the local politicians. Usually there are youth councils as well.
That's all of those questions so far.
Okay. So what about my questions? My first question is, I would like to hear about other examples of good practice. And on the top of that, you can also talk about some plans for development of good practice example or some kind of action plans, if you have them. So if you are a representative of the youth NGO or youth council or some expert group, and you have some good experience of existing means of digital inclusion of young people or means of digital inclusion that are just being developed.
And remember, if you do want to use your audio, just raise your hand in the panel. There's actually one hand now raised from Antonio. So Antonio, I will unmute you now. Go ahead, Antonio.
Hi, I'm Antonio from Extremadura in the southwest of Spain. It was really interesting to hear you. And today we received the invitation from Davide to share our good practice during the Symposium in Tallinn. So we will be able to give you more details. At the moment, we developed the regional digital literacy program in Extremadura. And you were talking before about rural areas and rural territories in Eastern Europe. We are a really rural area. So actually we are the most rural area in Spain and the poorest region, so to say, when we talk about economy in Spain. So we have a plan. We have the youth unemployment employment plan, and it consists of different talks and awareness raising activities directed to different profiles of youth. So we have 3 different profiles: youth with no education who live in very rural areas, and we have a second profile, which is youth who already attended some kind of formal education, and then the third step will be to youth people who already attended university, but they are unemployed, since we have a very high unemployment rate in Extremadura. And those talks, we have been developing them during the last year. And now we are starting with a second step of those talks, and we called it the Digital Social Lab, which is something that the youth, the participants, have asked for, and is a space for the experimentation. No, they are not so familiar with this idea of lab or this maker culture, and now we are enabling spaces where they can experiment with technologies with no objective. We are creating spaces where they can propose their own projects, and we are just trying to guide them and giving them some tips so they can reach their own objectives. And this is something we just started last month, and now we are having some pilot experiences. That's why I cannot give you a lot of conclusions. We are very excited because the experiences are being great, mainly because we are talking about very rural spaces where this did never happened before. And this is the experience I would like to share with you today. And today I will start also about a presentation with the data we collected during the last few months to share it during the Symposium in Tallinn.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Antonio. I mean, Spain is, sorry, have you finished?
Yeah.
Spain is actually quite an interesting country. I know quite a few examples of very successful science projects and science networks, and Spain is currently competing to be one of the Europe's center for nuclear physics. So, you know, I'm sure that you will do quite well. and that you will develop infrastructure that will serve the young people in the best manner. You know, thank you. So do you have some other good practice example or some questions for me?
Mara wrote a message here and asked to mention that the Youth Partnership is almost ready with a first draft compendium of good practices on digitalization and social inclusion, and this will be shared with all symposium participants during the next following days. So we will get a lot of info soon.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the symposium and to all of these publications and all of the infos. What about other participants of this webinar? Do you have anything to share? Maybe not a good practice example, but some concerns, some questions that should be raised?
I can make for myself a small comment in the meanwhile. I'm part of an organization that trains youth workers on youth work organizations on digital issues. And one thing we keep bumping up into kind of echoes this concern about building only digital apps and this way also excluding some people. Because what we've bumped into several times is that youth organizations have this kind of idea that they need to develop an app or a platform basically only for the sake of developing an app or a platform. So there is no clear idea what the goals are or how it actually ties into existing youth work practice. And in this, I can really clearly see also the concern that if we move all the services into this platform that actually no one is using because it's maybe also unstructured and unclear on what the goals are, then some people will also be excluded from the services.
Yeah, that's why really, when you're devising a means of digital youth work, you should also think of this world that happens face to face. I have some examples of the NGOs and the youth workers who very enthusiastically have devised a mobile app and started some kind of youth work digitally. But then, of course, because it was not rooted in their everyday activities and it was not structured in a way that it assures sustainability, it was a very short term, and if possible, they should be, of course, avoided. Especially because during this process, you have some people who really tag on these platforms or devices and expect provision of help and advice continuously. And if you don't really think about sustainability and how it is rooted in your everyday activities, then everything can suddenly stop and leave these young people actually in, without any help anymore. Any other examples of good practice or any other concerns?
Mara is proposing a question. Does anyone know of any tools, even digital, to map the outreach of online youth services? So to see better who is actually using them. And this is for a question of related to the geographical dimension of social exclusion. Does anyone have an idea, or do you, Dunya, have an idea?
Well, you can devise a small info questionnaire for the users of this platform with the data on their location. But then, especially in regard to the new GDPR, it is actually questionable. I'm not sure how it would work now. It was actually easier before. So currently, anything that is in line with the GDPR, well, it's probably very classical counting of the unique visits, but I don't know how to relate them to geographical units. Yeah, this is actually a very sensitive question.
There is now
if you talk about rural, for example, rural areas, there are some municipalities with literally 10 young people. So if you devise a short info sheet asking them like what is their age and what is their locality, you're actually breaching their privacy. So yeah, this is a very sensitive question.
There are now a couple of written questions, but there is also a raised hand from Heidi. So I will now unmute Heidi. You're on, Heidi.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, just I'm not sure if I understood this last question correctly, but if I did, the way I interpreted it was whether you can find out statistics of usage of certain apps in some geographical areas. And the point about GDPR, I think, was on point. However, there are ways still to access some of the, I guess, more anonymized data. Of course, if you have a very specific geographical area, very small, and in the way that you can narrow it down to one person, of course, that's outside of the scope. But there are actually apps that exist that actually the industry uses. And an example of that would be App Annie. So that's APPANNIE. There's so this is a platform that lets you access some of the basically crowdsourced statistics on usage of different types of apps. I think they really narrow it down to a specific app. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't have much experience with this application, but for the person who asked, maybe this is something to look at, and I'm sure there's also other solutions.
Thanks, Heidi. Then a couple of written questions. Camille is saying, I am a bit thoughtful on how much young people you and everyone working in the youth field involve and work with, not as recipients and target group, but as your colleagues on equal basis. So a question about youth participation, clearly. How much do we actually, as a field, how much do we involve young people in planning and implementing our activities? Dunja, you're muted now. We can't hear you.
Okay, thank you. Well, as a researcher, I always take into account the opinion of young people. So usually when devising research, we almost always have youth NGOs working with us. And youth NGOs are also partners on some implementing steps or policy implementation. When talking about youth participation, actually youth participation in sense of their social inclusion is the most developed channel of youth inclusion. So you have many countries, regions, and local communities that actually do take into account a vote of young people. But these are mainly in relation to the official politics and some sport activities, cultural activities, and so on. So it really depends on the locality. But as a researcher, I'm always trying to take into account the opinion of young people, and as I said, I'm a partner to many youth NGOs.
Yep. Then there's a question from Mark E. Taylor again. What about the young people who do not want to be digitally, socially included? How should youth organizations or services engage with them?
Yeah, I mean, there are some classical ways of reaching these young people, which are actually kind of more difficult. So like street youth work, especially if you're working with young people with some social issues or behavioral issues, young people who are homeless. So really you have to have youth workers who are well experienced in direct youth work, in street youth work, and actually to be able to get young people to trust you and to be confident that you are going to help them without actually breaching their right to live the way they would like to live. It is quite difficult, but of course it has to be done. If there are funds and if there is support from the local organizations. And during this process, of course, you have to build to actually empower these people and to get to trust them to actually, well, maybe try to get them included in the activities of your organization. But yeah, it is very difficult. It is actually the hardest part of the youth work, to access the young people who would like to stay away from all kind of informal and formal structures and organizations.
Okay, Mark says thank you on the chat. Then Veselina proposes or comments that they don't have a good practice to share, but just wanted to comment on the apps, as now every organization and or service is making their own apps. It might be actually very excluding in the sense that the phones might have a very limited space. So the technical reality could be that you can't install any new apps. And so if you would want to install a new app, let's say for a youth service, then you would have to let go of something else. And in this way, she believes, which I also share this belief, that it could be better to restrain from developing many new apps, but just rather use the existing ones instead. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, very often, to my experience, youth organizations and youth and structures actually supporting youth organizations do not cooperate. So first of all, we need intersectoral cooperation. We also need horizontal cooperation. Very often you have competing among the youth NGOs because the funds are actually scarce and positions in the decision-making bodies. So for instance, in the National Youth Council or local or regional youth council are also scarce. So if there is a high degree of competition, it may result in many applications that would be not actually accessible for young people, and they actually might be very confusing. So of course, all this digital youth work and digital social inclusion should be followed by cooperation between the youth sector and the formal organization, and of course intersectoral cooperation and cooperation inside the youth sector, so among the youth organization, which is very often not the case.
Maria also proposes that new apps should tackle specific gaps in the services in order to avoid duplication.
Yeah. That's actually related to the previous question.
Yeah. Heidi has their hand raised again, so let me unmute them now. Please go ahead, Heidi.
Thanks. Yeah. So I was just wondering. So I used to work at a youth organization that had their point is harm reduction. We had also developed an app I still don't know exactly why we developed it. Since I now work in the like design industry, I have more knowledge of that, so I know also what budgets kind of go into developing apps as opposed to, say, websites. And I was wondering really, because currently I'm not so involved in the like strategic decision-making process of any youth organization, so I'm not really sure, and I would like someone to explain this to me. Why is it that organizations decide to go ahead and develop apps, even though, I mean, partly this was answered like because of the funding, because of how different organizations compete among each other, but isn't the ultimate goal of each organization to reach more people and to help people? And you could do that better with, let's say, I don't know, off the top of my head, let's say you could develop a website that is mobile friendly, does not require anyone to develop, to first of all download an app. It costs a lot less to develop that. So why don't organizations simply go ahead and develop something like that as opposed to developing a full-blown app? Is this just like an assumption that organizations make due to their maybe lack of skills or lack of I don't know, connection with experts on this topic, or is it something else? Why is this even happening in the first place?
Well, I really think that it is due to lack of cooperation and also lack of insights. So very often they're not aware of other apps existing. And something that can be related to the insights I got during one expert meeting that was held 2 weeks ago. Well, you said that all youth organizations should aim to to reach the best for the young people. That's true, but also youth workers or youth leaders working in these organizations may have different personal goals. So we actually talked during this expert meeting about the identity of the youth worker. And we realized that many youth workers actually do not want to call themselves or identify themselves as youth worker. They would like to be youth leaders, in order to get better recognition in society and maybe to get career in some other sector later on. And sometimes it might happen that it looks better if the organization has, its own application than the website. It looks better in the resume of the person who would like to be, youth leader to compete for some other funds or some other position and so on. I mean, there are different reasons. We cannot give a unique explanation for, for all organizations and all levels of youth work.
Maybe the last question, we are almost out of time, so Dunja, you have to answer very briefly. The question is, does mainstream research on social inclusion reflect on how big data is being used to improve social inclusion policies?
Well, sadly, big data are often used only to make an introduction for social inclusion policy. And in general, evidence-based policy is still something like an item on the wish list, something that simply looks good on the paper, and we should all work further to develop evidence-based policy and to use big data and, of course, some other specialized data. But yeah, I mean, there are so many data just lying around, so many open databases that are not used. So definitely they should be used in conceiving digital youth inclusion policies.
Thank you. And finally, a tip from Veselina. There is a good practice, a WhatsApp-based game created by the Red Cross and Red Crescent called What Futures. So if you Google Red Cross what features you can find a WhatsApp-based game. So this is an interesting one. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much, Dunia, for
thank you, everyone.
presenting here. And
Thank you.
finally, I would like all the participants to give us a little bit of feedback. So I am launching a poll now. You should be able to rate this webinar in terms of how you feel. Just a few seconds more, almost everyone has voted already. Okay, so we are up to 88%, and this is how it looks. Most of you have been very happy with this webinar. Unfortunately, some people have thought that the webinar wasn't so good. Now we can't get into details why, but it was actually a misclick from between excellent and poor. So we can probably ignore this one answer. Thank you for clarifying. But thank you everyone for being here today. And this is all we have. And I hope everyone or most of you will also join us in the very last webinar, which is tomorrow at the same time on smart youth work. So I wish everyone has a good day, and I will see you when I see you, and see you in Estonia probably. Bye.
See you. Thank you. Bye.